I call her my daughter, and I mean that in every way that matters. If you think you know where this story ends up, I'll tell you right now, you don't. My name is Bernard. I'm 63 years old. I live in a house on the edge of Truro, Nova Scotia, with a wood stove that takes 3 tries to light every morning, and a yellow lab named Biscuit, who has figured out how to open the pantry door. I'm retired now, 31 years with the municipal waterworks. Not glamorous, but steady. I know every pipe under this town. I know which valves to turn and which ones to leave alone. I thought I knew the Samos people. I was wrong about one of them. My daughter Fiona was born in February during a storm that knocked out the power on the whole east side of Truro for 4 hours. Her mother, my ex-wife Connie, labored through the last part in candlelight. The nurses had flashlights. I held Connie's hand and counted the seconds between contractions and thought, if this baby comes out and she's okay, nothing else in my life will ever feel difficult again. Fiona came out screaming. She was fine. She had my nose and Connie's temper from the very first minute. Connie and I lasted until Fiona was 4. We tried, both of us. We just weren't built for each other in the long run. The split was civil enough. Connie moved to Dartmouth, remarried a few years later, a decent man named, well, it doesn't matter. She built her life. I built mine. We shared Fiona, traded weekends, showed up together for school concerts and skating recitals, and that one disastrous spring fair where Fiona entered her hamster in a talent show, and the hamster escaped into the bleachers. Fiona grew up fine, better than fine. The thing about Fiona is that she was never the kid who fit neatly into a category. Her teachers liked her but couldn't quite place her. She was social, but only when she chose to be. She was brilliant with numbers, not in a showy math Olympiad way, just in a quiet, she always knew what things were actually worth kind of way. She had a gift for seeing through to what something really cost, financially and otherwise. When she was 19, she was diagnosed with ADHD. Late diagnosis, which explained a lot, the scattered mornings, the hyperfocus on things that interested her, the inability to sit through anything she found meaningless. What the diagnosis didn't explain, and what I already knew, was that she was one of the most perceptive people I'd ever met. She didn't miss much. She just processed it differently. She went to NSCC, studied business and accounting, started working at a small logistics firm in Burnside. Within 3 years, she'd reorganized their invoicing system, found an error that had been losing them $40,000 a year for 6 years, and negotiated herself into a junior partnership. She was 25. I was proud of her in that specific way that makes it hard to talk about. I'd just say, "Good job, kid," and she'd roll her eyes, and we both knew what I meant. She met her husband at a work conference in Halifax. His name was Philip. Late 30s, well-dressed, worked in commercial real estate development. He had the handshake of a man who had practiced it. He called me sir the first time we met, and I told him Bernard was fine, and he said, "Of course, sir," and I let it go. I didn't dislike him. That's important. I didn't have a strong feeling about him either way, which I now understand was its own kind of signal. Fiona was happy. He treated her well in the visible ways. They bought a condo in Dartmouth, nice place, waterfront view. Visited twice, ate meals at their kitchen island on stools that were too tall for me, smiled when I was supposed to smile. They got married on a Saturday in October. Outdoor ceremony, tent reception, the whole thing. Fiona wore a cream dress and looked so much like her mother at that age that I had to look at the ground for a second when she came down the aisle. I walked her all the way to the front, and then I sat down and Biscuit was not there because dogs weren't invited, and I felt slightly unmoored without him. Philip smiled at her the way men smile when they know people are watching. I noticed. I put it away. The first 3 years of their marriage seemed fine from the outside. Fiona worked, Philip developed properties. They traveled a few times a year, Portugal, Mexico, a ski trip to Whistler. She called me every Sunday. We talked about work, about Biscuit, about the cracks forming in my back porch. Normal Sunday calls. Then she stopped calling every Sunday. Then it was every other week. Then I'd call and she'd pick up but sound flat, like someone doing an impression of themselves. I asked once if everything was all right. She said, "Yeah, Dad, just tired." I said, "Okay." I shouldn't have said okay. The thing about ADHD, especially in women, especially diagnosed late, is that the people who love them can sometimes use it against them. Fiona had always struggled with the paperwork side of adult life, the filing, the renewals, the tracking of which bill was due when. She'd built systems over the years, spreadsheets and color-coded folders, but it was work for her in a way it wasn't for other people. Philip knew this. He started offering to handle things, insurance renewals, the joint account, the mortgage paperwork. She let him, she was busy, she trusted him, he was her husband. I only found out later how thoroughly he'd restructured their finances during those years, how he'd moved her off the joint accounts gradually, how her salary had been redirected through a company he'd incorporated in her name, but that she had no actual access to. How he'd had her sign documents in stacks when she was tired, when she was rushing to work, with a quick just paperwork for the Burnside project. The lawyer needs it by tomorrow. She signed. She trusted him. When she turned 31, Fiona was audited. Not Philip, Fiona. The CRA sent a letter to her office. It said she owed $112,000 in unpaid taxes on income from a numbered company she apparently owned. She stared at that letter for what she later told me was about 10 minutes without blinking. Then she called me. I was in the backyard replacing a fence post when my phone rang. I heard her voice and I knew before she said a word. I've been her father for 31 years. I know what her scared sounds like. Dad, I need to help. I put the fence post down. I said, "Tell me everything," she told me. It took a long time. By the end of it, I was sitting on the back steps and Biscuit had put his head in my lap and I was just listening. When she finished, I sat there for a moment. Then I said, "Okay, don't touch anything. Don't talk to him about what you know. Not yet. I'm coming down Saturday." I came down Saturday. I'm a retired water systems technician, not a lawyer or an accountant. But I've lived 63 years in this country. I know what a professional looks like and I know how to find one. I spent Friday evening on the phone with a friend from the municipal union who knew a family law solicitor in Halifax, who knew a forensic accountant who had testified in 3 provincial fraud cases. By the time I drove to Dartmouth on Saturday morning, I had names written on a piece of paper in my shirt pocket. Fiona opened the door. She looked like she hadn't slept. Philip was not there. He was, she said, at a site meeting. We sat in the kitchen on those 2 tall stools, and I spread the names out on the island and said, "These are the people we're calling on Monday." She looked at me. She said, "Dad, it's probably just a misunderstanding." I looked back at her. I said, "Fiona, is it?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "No." I said, "Okay, then we figure it out." The next 4 months were the hardest I've watched her go through, and I've watched her go through a fair amount. Leaving him was not simple. They had the condo. They had joint assets. They had a dog of their own, a scruffy terrier mix named Clover that Fiona had rescued from the SPCA 2 years before. She was the one who fed Clover, walked Clover, paid Clover's vet bills. Philip liked having a dog the way he liked having a waterfront view. She moved out in February, took Clover, moved into a furnished apartment in Bedford, 40 minutes from Dartmouth, but far enough. I drove down twice a month. We ate takeout pho from a place she liked on Sackville Drive. We talked through the paperwork piece by piece. What the forensic accountant found was worse than we'd expected, and also more documented than we'd hoped. Philip had, over 6 years, redirected approximately $318,000 of Fiona's income through the numbered company. He'd drawn it back out through invoices to his development firm for consulting services. Services Fiona had never performed. He'd paid himself. The taxes had gone unpaid in her name. He'd known about the CRA situation for 8 months before the letter arrived and had said nothing. The forensic accountant laid it out in a 40-page report with appendices. Clear as water. Clearer, actually, than most water I've seen. Fiona's solicitor filed for divorce. They filed a separate civil suit. They sent a detailed package to the CRA explaining the fraud and requesting an administrative review. The CRA, to their credit, moved on it faster than I expected. Philip, when confronted, did what I imagine he always did. He performed. He was shocked. He was hurt. He had a counter-narrative ready, same as he'd had the right handshake ready. He told his own lawyer, who told Fiona's lawyer, that Fiona had been fully aware of the arrangements, that this was a mutual financial strategy, that she was now, after the marriage failed, retroactively reframing it as fraud. She had ADHD, he said. She had difficulty managing complex financial matters. He'd been helping her. I want you to sit with that for a second. He took 6 years of her money. Then he handed her diagnosis back to her like it was a weapon. I drove to Dartmouth the week after we heard his counter-narrative. I sat in Fiona's apartment and she was furious, the right kind of furious, not the collapsed kind. And she was going through her own records, which she'd kept better than he'd counted on. Fiona had always kept records. It was part of how she coped. Color-coded folders going back to her first year at NSCC. Every bill, every transfer, every receipt. Here is the thing Philip had not accounted for. Fiona, for all her difficulties with spontaneous organization, was meticulous about documentation when she built a system for it. And she'd been suspicious of him, quietly, incompletely, in a way she hadn't let herself fully believe, for at least 2 years before the CRA letter. During those 2 years, she had been forwarding emails to a private account he didn't know about, screenshots of bank transfers, a photo of a document she'd been asked to sign, taken on her phone in the bathroom of their condo while he waited in the next room. She had 67 separate pieces of documented correspondence. I looked at those folders spread across her kitchen table and I thought, this is who I raised. Not someone who needed to be protected. Someone who had already been protecting herself, long before she let herself admit she needed to. The civil case took 14 months. I won't walk through all of it. Some of it was procedural and dull. Some of it was the kind of thing you don't describe in polite conversation. The hearing that mattered happened on a Thursday in April, in a courtroom in downtown Halifax on Upper Water Street. I took the day off from the woodpile, drove in with Fiona, found parking in the parkade behind the library, walked with her to the courthouse in the cold. Philip's lawyer had built a case around Fiona's ADHD diagnosis. They had her old performance reviews from work, from before she reorganized the invoicing system, and before she made junior partner. They had a psychiatrist who had never met Fiona but was prepared to speak generally about executive function challenges in adults with ADHD. They had framed the entire thing as a story of a well-meaning husband managing a wife who couldn't manage herself. It was the cleanest, most insulting thing I have ever seen assembled in a professional setting. Fiona's solicitor let them finish. Then she stood up. She submitted the 67 documents. She submitted the forensic accounting report. She submitted 3 years of Fiona's performance reviews from after the reorganization of the invoicing system, which showed 2 promotions and a commendation from the board. She submitted the testimony of Fiona's business partner at the logistics firm, who had worked alongside her for 6 years and who described in specific detail what Fiona's analytical ability actually looked like in practice. And then Fiona herself took the stand. She was calm. That's the word. I have seen Fiona excited. I have seen her anxious. I have seen her furious in the exact right way. I had never seen her this calm. She answered every question in complete sentences. When Philip's lawyer tried to suggest she hadn't understood the documents she'd signed, Fiona said, quietly and without hesitation, I've reconstructed the cash flow from those documents. Would you like me to walk through it? There was a pause. That won't be necessary, the lawyer said. I have it here, Fiona said. She held up a single page. It's 1 page. It's not complicated. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt considered, like everyone in it had decided at the same moment to stop shuffling papers. Philip's counter-narrative had one structural problem that no amount of performance could fix. He'd used her ADHD as proof she couldn't understand what he'd done. But Fiona, standing in that courtroom with 67 documents and a 1-page cash flow summary and 6 years of work history that said otherwise, was its own answer. Her existence in that room was the rebuttal. Every accommodation she'd built for herself, every color-coded folder, every forwarded email, every photograph taken in a bathroom while her husband waited in the next room. It had all been, without her quite knowing it, preparation for this day. The judge did not rule from the bench. These things take time in Nova Scotia, and I'm old enough to know you wait. But the CRA administrative review had already concluded 3 weeks earlier. The fraud findings stood, liability transferred to Philip, Fiona's debt discharged. That part was already done. This was civil recovery. We walked out of the courthouse into April Halifax. Cold, gray, the harbor visible between buildings. Fiona was quiet for a block, and then she said, I'm hungry, can we get chowder? We went to a place she knew near the waterfront, sat by the window. Ordered fish chowder, and the kind of bread that comes in a paper bag. She said, I keep thinking about all the things I should have seen earlier. I said, you saw them. You just needed time to believe what you were seeing. She looked out at the harbor. I said, you had 67 documents, Fiona. You built that on your own. I didn't tell you to do that, she said. I know. I said, ADHD or not, nobody takes that many screenshots by accident. She laughed. First real laugh I'd heard from her in a long time. It sounded like her, like that February baby who came into the world in the middle of a power outage, screaming, already making sure everyone knew she'd arrived. The civil judgment came down 6 weeks later. I read it at my kitchen table in Truro, with Biscuit asleep under my chair and the wood stove finally lit on the second try. Recovery of $318,000 in redirected income plus interest plus legal costs. Referral of the matter to the Nova Scotia Prosecution Service for review of potential criminal charges. I folded the paper. I put it on the table. I sat there for a minute with my coffee going cold. Then I called Fiona. She picked up on the second ring. "Did you see it?" she said. "I saw it." She was quiet. "Then thanks for coming down, Dad. All those times." I said, "That's what I'm here for." We talked for a while longer, about Clover, about her new apartment, about a small accountancy practice she was thinking about starting. She said she had a name for it already. I said, "What name?" She said she was still deciding, but it would be something that made clear, right from the front door, that she knew what things were actually worth. I said that sounded about right. We said goodbye. I put the phone down. Outside the window, the yard was just starting to think about spring. The fence post I'd replaced in February was solid. Biscuit had gotten up from under the chair and was looking at me with the patient, thorough attention he gives to anything he thinks might lead to a walk. I pushed my chair back, clipped his leash on. We went out into the cold Truro morning, down the street, past the neighbors' hedges still brown from winter, toward the trail that runs along the river. I walk it most mornings. I've walked it since before Fiona was born. The water moves at the same pace regardless of what's happening on the banks. There's something in that I've always found useful. I walked the whole trail that morning, all the way to the old mill site and back. Biscuit trotted ahead of me, nose to the ground, committed to some investigation I couldn't see. The air was cold and tasted like river and soil and almost spring. I thought about Fiona at the courtroom, holding that one piece of paper. I thought about all those color-coded folders. I thought about her voice on the phone that first Saturday, the scared sound that I recognized after 31 years. And then I thought about the laugh over fish chowder on Upper Water Street, the real one, the one that sounded exactly like herself. I didn't raise a victim. I raised a woman who kept records. When I got back to the house, I started the stove again. It caught on the first try.